So we're going to start off a new lecture on writing our own functions. We've already written our own subroutines, and we've used functions that are built into Visual Basic, like rand and the rounding function. But now we're going to write our own functions. So that will be our objective for today: to write and use your own functions, to use pieces of code repeatable, right? To use pieces of code over and over again that also returns a value. So remember, a function is different from a subroutine. And we're going to talk about the difference right now and talk about functions and arguments in general. Then we're going to talk about writing our own functions and do a few examples. So let's get going. So let's talk about functions again. Remember, a function is just like a subroutine. It's a chunk of code that executes at once, right? You run this subroutine and it does a bunch of code. And it can take arguments when it's called. So you don't just say, run my function. You say, run my function with a piece of information. But what makes it different from a subroutine is that a function actually returns a value, which means that it's not just a chunk of code that executes. It executes and then gives back a number. So let me show you an example. So subroutines, here's some examples of subroutines with arguments. This is just some subroutine I made up called cube message box. Anyway, you call the subroutine. You pass it an argument like for example, 3 or textbox1.text or my variable or whatever. Okay, but it doesn't return any value. You don't have anything equaling this. You don't have this going into an if statement or being placed into another message box or something. Okay, it's just a subroutine on its own. It gets called, the code inside it runs, and that's it. A function, on the other hand, returns a value. You set something equal to the function. So for example, a variable called cube number is equal to cube function because this function returns a value. Okay, or for example, if cube function is greater than 50, right, you can say cube function of 4. Let's say this function cubes the number 4. 4 times 4 is 16 times 4 is 64. And so if cube function of 4 is, so this is going to return the number 64, and that's greater than 50. So instead of just a chunk of code, it's actually returning a number. It's giving back a value when you run it. That's what a function does. And of course, Visual Basic has several built-in functions. We learned about rand, which returns a random number between 0 and 1. And we learned how to multiply that by 100 to give it a number between 0 and 100. And then we said, well, that's nice, but we'd also like to maybe make sure that it's an integer to round it. And for that, we can use math.round, which is another built-in function. And you just put in the number first, and then the number of decimals that you want after the decimal point. So it has two different arguments, which is interesting. The first argument, which is the number, and the second number, how many decimal points you want to round it to. So for example, it looks like there is no example there, but you could say math.round of 56.7, comma 0, and that would round that to 57. All right, so let's learn how to write our own functions. We don't have to just use those built-in ones like rand and the round function. We're going to write our own. Okay, so here's how this goes down. It's not very different from how you would write your own subroutine, except that instead of sub, we say function. So let me show you. We start by saying private function, and then we give our function a name, and then the stuff that goes on inside the parentheses is just like it is for a subroutine. If we're going to pass it arguments, we say by val, and then the name of our argument, and as whatever type of variable it is. And I'm going to show you some examples if this is confusing. Inside the function, you can put any code you want as long as you return some number when you're done. Okay, so remember that's the difference, and then of course in the end there's end function. Remember that's the difference between a function and a subroutine. A function always returns a value, so you have to tell the computer what value it is you're returning. So let me show you an example to make this a little bit more clear. We're going to start with a function called square the number, which takes some number in as an argument as a decimal. So we say private function, and then we give our function a name. It's called square the number. Okay, and then it takes one argument by val number, so this number is coming in as a decimal. Okay, so we've got some argument called number inside our function called square the number, and of course we need to return the answer. So if this function is supposed to return a number squared, then we square it and return it. And that's all there is to it. End function. Okay, so this one is really simple. It takes number as an argument, squares it, and returns that value. So if I was to say textbox1.text is equal to square the number of 6, then the text box would read 36 because the 6 gets squared, and that gets returned as the function's value. Let me show you some more and more examples here so we get the picture of how this works. So imagine we have a function called circle area, okay, and it takes, again, one argument. In this case, it's called radius. okay, and as a decimal. And so we're going to pass this function a number called radius, okay, and it's going to calculate the area of a circle, which of course is just pi times the radius squared. So we say return pi, which is 3.1. We could do more numbers if we want, times the radius squared. And of course we need our end function at the end. Okay, so those are two really simple function examples. Oh, and then an important point is that when we call it, right, we pass it whatever number we want. We can say circle area of text box 1.text, and then you don't just call it, it returns a value, so we put that value in another text box, for example. Okay, and these are pretty simple functions, right? They just take one input and return a little bit of math with it. You can do some much more complicated stuff. And before we do that, let me just show you another example, right? If circle area of 12.4 is greater than 20, then you know you have a big circle. Okay, so circle area of 12.4, that's going to do pi times this square. It's going to be much bigger than 20. Okay, but this whole function will return a number. Let's say it's 55, I don't know what it is, and it's greater than 20. So you can use a function to return a value. That's the key point. And to return a value, you simply inside the function say return, and then the thing you want to return. It can be more complicated though, and this is where it gets interesting. You can say, all right, private function, this is a function that determines whether something is greater than 10 or not. Okay, so you say private function greater than 10, okay, and this takes a number as an integer, as its argument. And it says, okay, if the number is greater than 10, so it took number as an argument, and now it's testing to see whether it's greater than 10 inside the function, so this is interesting, then we return yes. Okay, if it's not greater than 10, then we return no. And that's our whole function. Okay, so one thing that's interesting is you can have more than one return statement like this. Okay, and you can also return strings. It doesn't have to be a number. Okay, if you are going to have more than one return statement, you should just make sure that there's only one way that the function can get returned. So you won't say like return yes and return no, right? If I have this if statement here, it either returns yes or it returns no. Okay, and so you can get infinitely complicated. You can call functions within functions or subroutines within functions. You can have a function that returns a decimal, that returns an integer. It's however you want to do it. And you can have all kinds of different code on the inside of the function to figure out what number, string, or value should be returned when the function is called. So for example, again, I can say, all right, greater than 10 of the first text box, then the second text box will get its value. So for example, if the number 4 was in the first text box, it would get passed into the function as number. If number is greater than 10, well, 4 is not greater than 10, so we'd go down to else, and it would return no. And that means that this whole right side of when it's called would just say no, and so the second text box would be no. However, if I put in a number like 15 in the first text box and then called this line of code, okay, 15 would get passed in as the number. The number 15 is greater than 10, and so the whole function would return yes. And that means that it would say textbox2.text equals yes. In other words, the text box text would say yes. All right, so we've already learned the vocabulary word function. This isn't something new. But if you want to go back to your notes, you should go back to your vocabulary and add a little bit about writing your own functions into the example section so you know how to do it for the future. Okay, there's two last assignments for this unit before we move on. The first one is called is divisible by, and that's a function that's going to calculate whether or not two numbers are divisible. So if you took 9 and said, is it divisible by 3? The answer is yes. But if you took 9 and said, is it divisible by 4? Then the answer is no. Easy stuff. And then the last one is a blackjack card converter. The super bonus challenge for this unit, if you get way ahead, is to create blackjack, like in the casino. And so this function will help you along that task if you want to go down that road, because you're going to need to write a function that converts a letter like king, queen, like K, Q, J, or A, or a number 0 to 9. Actually, it should be 1 to 9. Into its blackjack value. So for example, a king is worth 10 in blackjack, so it needs to convert it, that's all. All right, so that does it for this. We've learned about how to write our own functions. Go ahead and get started and start tackling assignments 6 and 7.